The answer to the now what is that we are about to undertake the greatest transformation of the world. We are about to experience the greatest economic miracle unfolding with the greatest industrial revolution of all times. We are about to witness the greatest scientific, technological, political, economic, and cultural uplift beyond anything that has ever been achieved on this planet. For this to happen, we have truly inexhaustible energy resources available to us. Nothing can hold us back except ourselves, and this isn't something that the new dawn of humanity will allow us to continue. So what that the next ice age begins in the 2050s or slightly sooner and begins almost explosively. We have the capacity within us as human beings to uplift our world to the stage where the ice age can have no effect on us. And we have the power to move beyond even that. Thus we will build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, and do it in the short span of time that we have left. Not in the old style, of course. We will build the new cities with such efficiency that we will produce them to one another for free, universally, as an investment into the greatest asset that humanity has, which is itself as human beings. This is not pie-in-the-sky stuff. The greatest potential for our self-development exists right now. The potential is real, and the greatest incentive that we can possibly have to realize this potential is also very real. The world ship is sinking into a new ice age with immense consequences. The incentive that we presently have is the greatest incentive that we can possibly have, which is for us to continue to live on the planet Earth. This type of incentive is supremely imperative. The challenge is to build up the greatest renaissance of all times. Our responding to the Ice Age challenge has this potential. Anything less than a full response to the Ice Age challenge is synonymous with committing suicide. And the time to start is now. It takes an enormous global effort for humanity to relocate itself from outside the tropics into the tropics, before the areas outside the tropics become uninhabitable. This leaves us roughly 30 years. We are presently at the 30% mark, measured in time, of the Titanic World Ship sinking back into its normal Ice Age glaciation cycle. The ratio is measured against the 1998 reference point, when the solar wind measurements began to be made by the Ulysses spacecraft in a polar orbit around the Sun, which detected a 30% drop-off in key measurements over a 10-year period. Contrary to mainstream science perception and general opinion, the world ship really is sinking, as the Titanic did in the past. The world ship is sinking back into the long-awaited next ice age. The sun is already diminishing. This is happening at an amazingly fast pace. Soon, nothing will be the same anymore. The Ice Age transition is not something that will happen gradually over the next 1,000 years. It has already started and is unfolding fast. The devastating California drought that began in 2011, which is now massively increasing, is a fringe effect on this path with devastating consequences. This means that we are already in the first phase of the Ice Age transition. The Ice Age transition promises to be a 3-stage event. During the first phase, which is unfolding slowly, the solar wind is diminishing. On Earth, only a few fringe events are experienced, such as droughts, flooding, changing weather patterns. The second phase begins after the solar wind has diminished to 0. At this point, the solar intensity itself begins to diminish, causing much harsher fringe effects for our world, along the line of the Little Ice Age of the 1600s. Agriculture begins to fail at this point, as it did in the 1600s. After that, the big phase shift occurs. The big phase shift happens when the minimal threshold is crossed, whereby the electromagnetic primal fields collapse that presently focus high-density plasma onto the Sun. I'll present the principle of the primal fields later. At that point, the point of the big phase shift to level 3, the solar surface temperature falls back from the present level of 5,800 degrees Kelvin to about 4,000 degrees. The effect on Earth will be that the next ice age begins in full force and agriculture fails globally, unless, of course, technological preparations were made for it to continue. The decisive phase shift that ushers in the next ice age will likely occur in the 2050s time frame or sooner. It could happen sooner, as soon as 30 years from now, or it may take longer. The timing is somewhat uncertain because no historic measurements exist. The previous ice age start happened 120,000 years ago. Also, solar activity details are not preserved in ice. The ice contains only temperature proxies. The little ice age that we have historic knowledge of doesn't give us much to go by, in spite of the fact that we have measurable solar activity proxies preserved from this period in the form of carbon-14 ratios. The only known natural source for the carbon-14 isotope on Earth is the interaction of solar cosmic ray flux with nitrogen in the atmosphere. The measurements of the carbon-14 ratio over the 1,200 years time span shown here show a great downslope occurring towards the little ice age. Obviously, some of the slope is caused by the atomic decay over time of the carbon-14 isotope. However, some of the downramping in the carbon-14 measurement obviously also reflects the general long-term downramping trend in solar activity that began more than 3,000 years ago, which is glaringly apparent in the ice core data from the Greenland ice sheet. While no sunspots observations have been reported for the times of the earlier climate minimum periods. Historic solar reports do exist for the Maunder minimum period of the Little Ice Age. It has been reported, based on careful observations with telescopes, that the sun was so weak in the 1600s that for a 30-year period almost no sunspots were observed. This period of weak solar activity is perfectly reflected in the carbon-14 data, which proves that the carbon-14 ratios are a reliable proxy for the historic intensity of the solar activity. It also proves that our Sun is a dramatically variable star, and it suggests that we may have come close in the 1600s to the start of the next ice age, perhaps to within a few years of its starting. We can say with certainty that the solar intensity was suddenly sharply ramped up before the phase shift to the full ice age could take place. The solar up-ramping shows up clearly in the carbon-14 data. The cause for it was likely one of the dance god Oeschger events that were only discovered recently, which I'll refer to later. It may well be that if the sun's up-ramping had not occurred, we would likely not exist today. The resulting ice age would have ended civilization. We have lived in a climate anomaly for the last 12,000 years, which is now ending. When the phase shift to the next glaciation period occurs, termed the Ice Age, which is the normal long-term climate on the Earth, its consequences will affect the global landscape without exception. The Ice Age phase shift is huge and has enormous consequences. It will affect the global agriculture deeply and thereby our food supply worldwide. And with it, it will affect the living of humanity more radically and more extensively than any other event in all of what we call history. Our agriculture and our civilization are both keyed to the nicely warm climates of the current interglacial period. Everything that we became was created during the easy living of the current interglacial period, as if no prior history existed. The transformation of the Earth back to its normal glacial conditions, as it had been for the last 500,000 years, promises to occur swiftly, in the space of weeks or months, in which the radiated solar energy diminishes by up to 70% to its ice age default level, while the global climate will adjust itself more slowly. Agriculture will be affected immediately. This means that we should pay attention to what the unfolding numerous forms of evidence that we have already gathered is telling us. The final outcome of the process, which numerous forms of evidence tell us is already in progress, is unavoidable. The numerous forms of evidence tell us that a huge transforming process is in progress, and that its outcome cannot be prevented, but that its effects can still be avoided. The effects can be avoided with the willful transformation of our living in such a manner that it renders the astrophysical phase shift to have no effect on it. This self-rescue by humanity is possible by relocating itself into the tropics where the solar influx is the strongest. This can be achieved, but will we do it? Under the current political climate, the answer is that we will do nothing. Likewise, in the current environment of politically constricted science, the Ice Age challenge is not even being recognized, nor the evidence for it, so that nothing will be done to meet and master the challenge. This means that in the current political climate, the greatest imperative at the present time will be ignored, even while the consequences from doing nothing will not be avoided. The steamship Titanic sank over a span of 160 minutes in the middle of the night on the 14th of April in 1912. The phase shift began with the ship's collision with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. At the 30-minute mark, when it was understood that the sinking of the ship cannot prevent it, the captain of the ship ordered the launching of the ship's lifeboats, which it had far too few of. The owners of the ship were severely criticized for the omission. But what about us? Our worldship is sinking with 7 billion people on board. We don't have any lifeboats at all, nor do we have the slightest intention to build any. When the Titanic sank, it sank with more than 2/3 of its passengers and crew remaining on the ship. For these, no lifeboats had been available. Surely, we want to do better this time around. That's the incentive. Humanity has an extremely poor historic track record in surviving Ice Age conditions. During the last 2 million years of the human journey, humanity has encountered more than 20 Ice Age periods of gradually increasing severity. It appears that each of the glaciation periods had devastating effects on humanity and may have caused the extinction of all but the current human species. We, the Homo sapien, are the 8th species, the shortest lived and the sole survivor, and this just barely. We emerged from the glaciation period, called the Ice Age, with an estimated total world population in the range of 1 to 10 million people. That's all we had after 2 million years running. The sparse population at the end of the last Ice Age illustrates, to some degree, the extreme severity of Ice Age conditions. In the period that followed the 90,000 years of the last glaciation, our current interglacial warm holiday from the cold called the Holocene epoch, we have developed ourselves into a 7 billion population, primarily by the power of our amazing technological advances. With the Holocene now fast ending, we face the awesome task to create the technological infrastructures that will enable us to enter the next deep glaciation period with a 7 to 10 billion world population, and to prosper in spite of the biologically sparse period of 90,000 years in duration. While it is possible to build the needed infrastructures for our survival in 30 years' time, The question remains, will we do it? Very few people are aware of the vast scope of the challenge that we faced during the glaciation periods, for the lack of any historic references in remembered experiences. The evident reason is that extremely few people had lived during the glaciation periods. It is only recently, since the end of the 1990s, through ice sample explorations, that we began to discover in detail what type of conditions were encountered during the glaciation periods, and how these conditions relate to our current climate. What we discovered with the ice coring projects verified previously developed Ice Age concepts that were based on data gleaned only from deep-sea sediments. However, the ice core data, especially from the Greenland ice, indicates that glaciation climates had been far more severe than was previously assumed. In comparison with the half-a-degree cooling that was experienced during the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, we are looking at a 20 degrees cooling during the real Ice Age conditions. This adds up to a 40 times steeper cooling than the worst that has been experienced in recorded history. That's what we have to deal with and prepare for. Failing to respond is, as I said, synonymous with committing suicide. The ice core data gleaned from the Greenland ice sheet also indicates that enormous temperature oscillations have occurred during the last glaciation period, with fast transitions from deep glaciation levels to near the interglacial level in the space of mere decades. The oscillations are termed the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations in honor of the researchers who discovered their consistent repetition in intervals of 1470 years. While the oscillations don't render the glaciation conditions significantly less severe, they add to the critical science perception of what causes the glaciation cycles in the first place. Ironically, it is here, in the perception department, where we face the greatest obstacles against our responding to the coming Ice Age conditions, and thereby face the greatest danger to our existence by us failing to respond. We encounter a problem in mainstream science which remains boxed into false assumptions about the nature of the sun, which is the driver for the climate on Earth. Whatever falls outside the box is deemed not to exist. There exist two fundamentally opposite models of the nature of the sun, the hydrogen sun model and the plasma sun model. Each has its corresponding theorized effect on the climate on Earth. The mainstream theory is that the sun is a sphere of hydrogen gas that is heated from within by nuclear fusion reactions occurring at its core. It is deemed that the energy transport from the core is an extremely slow process that's in the range of 30 million years. That's the theory. On the basis of the assumed long heat transfer process, the sun is generally regarded in this theory, in climate considerations, as an invariable constant. Thus it is assumed, further, that all Ice Age phenomena must be the result of other than solar causes. It has been theorized on the basis of this assumption that ice ages are caused by the interaction of long-term minute fluctuations of the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit around the Sun and of the Earth's spin axis inclination and its changing location. The problem with this theory, as a cause for the ice age cycles, is that the total solar energy that is received from the Sun remains always the same, regardless of how the Earth's spin axis is inclined and shifts geographically, and its orbit eccentricity varies. Thus, the orbital cycles theory is fast losing ground, while it remains the only mechanistic ice age theory that has been devised. As an alternative, exotic theories have been developed that attribute the ice age phenomena to natural CO2 fluctuations, along the line of the CO2 caused global warming doctrine, for which no evidence exists. In contrast with all that, outside the mainstream box stands the plasma sun theory, for which monumental evidence does exist, which fundamentally disproves the hydrogen sun theory and its assumptions. The plasma sun theory recognizes the Sun to be a sphere of plasma, rather than as a sphere of atomic gases. The term plasma refers to the basic particles of the universe, that all the atomic elements that are known to exist are created from. Plasma is a soup of primarily two types of basic particles, the proton and the electron, that carry a positive and negative electric charge, respectively, that causes their interaction by the electric force, a force that is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than gravity. Researchers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and others have come to the recognition that more than 99.999% of the mass of the universe exists in the form of plasma, most of it organized into vast networks of plasma streams that pervade the universe. In free-flowing plasma, the electrons and protons attract each other, but before they combine, a strong nuclear force repels them again, which forces the electron, that is nearly 2,000 times less massive than the proton, into an endless dance around the proton. However, in large plasma concentrations, as in the case of the Sun, the lighter electrons tend to migrate to the surface, where they form an electron-dense layer that covers the Sun with an electric sheath. The result is the inverse, in principle, of a gas sphere, which has its greatest density at its center. A plasma sphere has its greatest density at its surface. That's critical for the Sun to function. It also goes far beyond what mainstream cosmology is presently able to recognize, in spite of the evidence for it. As a sphere of plasma, our Sun is immensely electrically active, by which it is powered. The interaction of the electric sheath with external plasma that flows in interstellar plasma streams causes plasma fusion reactions to occur on the surface of the Sun. In the interaction, atomic structures are synthesized. Light is emitted from the created, highly energized atoms, which becomes the sunlight that illumines and warms the Earth. But since the dynamic actions that creates the Sun's radiated energy is dependent on external plasma flowing into the Sun, The Sun is in principle a highly variable star that varies with external plasma pressure. The Sun also emits solar cosmic ray flux. Cosmic rays are not streams of radiation. They are single events of immensely energized protons or electrons escaping from the magnetically confined plasma fusion process on the surface of the Sun. The density of the events is measurable. That's what we measure with the carbon-14 measurements. Solar cosmic ray flux is only possible from a plasma sun. No potential for it exists under the hydrogen sun model. The carbon-14 measurements prove that our sun is a plasma sun. The carbon-14 measurements tell us that the Sun emits cosmic ray flux from its reactive surface, and that this flux is attenuated by the plasma corona surrounding the Sun that varies in density, which reflects the solar activity intensity. The carbon-14 measurements also tell us that the ever-changing climate on Earth coincides consistently with the ever-changing intensity of solar activity. When the solar activity is high, the solar cosmic ray flux is weak, because more of it is absorbed in the plasma shell surrounding the Sun. Inversely, when the plasma shell is thinner, whereby the solar activity is weaker, the escaping solar cosmic ray flux is denser and increases cloud formation and cools the Earth. It has been experimentally verified with the CERN Lab Cloud project, with the result illustrated here that cosmic ray interaction with the atmosphere increases cloudiness. It is self-evident that increased cloudiness reflects more of the incoming sunlight back into space, whereby the Earth gets colder. This is the interacting effect that we see reflected in carbon-14 ratios coinciding with known climate anomalies. The carbon-14 measurements prove that the cooling for the Little Ice Age and the warming afterwards are both the direct result of changes in solar activity. The measurements prove that the Sun can change massively and rapidly. This proof gives us a basis for the recognition of the Ice Age cycles that are likewise caused by the ever-changing Sun, and that fast transitions to glaciation is possible as the consequence of the changing Sun. The measurements disprove the theory that the Sun is a constant factor in climate considerations. The perception of the plasma Sun as a variable star is critical for us launching an effective response in the world to the Ice Age challenge. It is imperative, in fact, to recognize that the Sun is externally powered and is thereby inherently variable, and is highly affected by supply fluctuations, and that its operating on this basis causes ice ages on Earth with quick transitions, and the rapid climate oscillations termed Tedesco oscillations that the ice coring projects have revealed in the early 2000s time frame. The plasma sun theory is built on the pioneering work of the Swedish explorer Hannes Alfvén, who devised the galactic model for the plasma universe concept, which he may have pioneered in the first place. He received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his related work. The plasma universe concept that Hannes Alphen had pioneered reflects the ever-widening scientific recognition that more than 99.999% of the mass of the universe exists in the form of plasma instead of atomic elements. One of the modern supporters of the plasma theory concept, Anthony Parrott, as director of experiments of the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the United States, conducted a series of experiments to discover how the magnetic effect of moving electric particles shaped the geometry of the resulting plasma flow structures. He noted a surprising similarity of the experimentally derived plasma shapes with archetypal drawings from widely dispersed areas of the world. He suggests that similar plasma flow structures may have been visible in ancient skies. We still have some large-scale plasma flow features visibly apparent in our galaxy. Another researcher, David Lapointe, devised a series of static experiments that replicate the bowl-type magnetic field structures that naturally form in plasma flow dynamics. With his experiments, he was able to replicate the process of interstellar plasma streams becoming electromagnetically concentrated around a sun, by the action of what he calls the primal fields. It has been recognized long ago that electric currents flowing in the same direction attract each other magnetically by what is called the Lorentz force. Free-flowing plasma in space becomes pinched thereby to ever tighter confinement until a point is reached when the magnetic fields tangle up and cause an opening for the concentrated plasma to flow out. This is the process in principle that transports plasma to a sun. Long plasma streams pervade interstellar space that link the stars together into chains. There's always an inflow and an outflow occurring at the stage of a solar system, which consumes only a portion of the plasma stream that becomes afterwards renewed. It has been experimentally recognized that at a node point, the point of disruption of the plasma flow, the plasma stream is curled backwards and becomes magnetically concentrated under a confinement dome, from which a portion of highly concentrated plasma flows out, typically onto a sun. We see these features in both the static experiments by David Lapointe and in the dynamic experiments by Anthony Parrott conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and we see it reflected also in space, around the sun as a void in the solar wind that the Ulysses spacecraft has detected. The plasma focused through the primal fields creates the plasma sphere that surrounds the sun and interacts with its electron-rich layer where the plasma fusion takes place, in which atomic forms are synthesized, from which light is emitted. A part of the evidence that the plasma sun is very real is seen in the sunlight that flows out from it. We see the sunlight as a seamless band of color which cannot originate from a hydrogen gas sun. It can only originate from a plasma fusion process at the surface of a plasma sun. No other source is possible. If the sun was a sphere of hydrogen gas, it we would see a totally different spectrum of light, which would be typical for what is emitted from hydrogen atoms. Light is a phenomenon that is created by atomic elements that have energy impressed upon it. Light from different elements is emitted in different spectra. It takes a rich mix of large number of different atomic elements with different emission spectra to create the seamless band of color that we see in the sunlight. But whenever light encounters atoms in its path, the photon energy of the light is absorbed by them, depending on the characteristic of the specific atomic element. The absorbed energy is then retransmitted, but in a scattered fashion. The end result is that voids appear in the seamless band of sunlight, where the light is absorbed. A large number of voids have been detected in the light from the sun. Their presence indicates that the plasma sphere surrounding the sun is pervaded with a wide range of atomic elements. These elements would not be present as densely around the sun if they were not synthesized by the sun itself. Thus the sunlight proves that the sun is a plasma sun, which renders it a variable sun. If this wasn't the case, we wouldn't be able to see the brilliantly colorful landscapes that we see. The fact that we see color-rich landscapes proves that the sun cannot be a sphere of hydrogen gas powered from the inside, if such a process was actually possible, but is a plasma sun that is externally powered. It also proves that the sun, by being externally powered, has the potential to cause an ice age, with rapid transitions leading into it. This further means that ice ages are not caused by the sun itself, but by interstellar classes. An externally powered sun is obviously not its own master. It is subject to change with external conditions, such as electric resonance effects in interstellar plasma streams. While we cannot see plasma itself, because plasma is invisible, we are able to detect the end effects and detect the changing of the effects. One of the detectable effects is the solar wind. The solar wind is faintly visible in some cases by its plasma mix with atomic elements. The solar wind is escaping plasma that is electromagnetically accelerated away from the sun against the force of gravity to the high velocity of up to 800 kilometers per second. The solar wind originates within the plasma fusion cells, where sunlight is created and atomic elements are synthesized. The solar wind is plasma that escapes from the fusion cell when the inflowing plasma density exceeds the magnetic confinement strength of the primal fields that concentrate the plasma. On a large cosmic scale, it is called the jet stream. On the solar scale, it is called the solar wind. The escaping solar wind can be seen as steam boiling off from a kettle that is extremely heated, from which, when the heat is cut back, less steam is emitted. On the sun, when the plasma pressure around it is reduced, the solar wind diminishes accordingly as less excess plasma exists. We are presently at a stage where we see the solar wind, the solar steam, as it were, diminishing at the amazing rate of 30% over the span of 10 years. That's huge. The solar wind pressure flowing away from the Sun was measured by NASA's Ulysses spacecraft. The 30% difference was measured between its first and last orbit around the Sun in its polar orbit between 1998 and 2008. This type of enormous differential in such a short time is only possible for an externally powered Sun. But it is also scary. What it hints at is scary. The measured reduction points to the long-expected Ice Age transition to be happening in the 2050s, according to linear forward projections of the measurements provided by Ulysses. The big change in solar wind pressure is not possible under the hydrogen sun theory, where the energy flow into the surface is theorized to take a 30 million years path. Such a sun does not change rapidly, but it is possible for a plasma sun to change this fast with plasma inflow fluctuations. That's what we see. As the Ulysses spacecraft has seen firsthand, the Sun is changing, and is changing rapidly. Also, we see the sunspot cycles diminishing at the same fast rate as the change in solar wind pressure. And we see both happening at the same time. We see the Sun visibly getting weaker on two of these major fronts. We also see the same weakening happening in magnetic pole drift measurements in the north above Canada. If the Earth was orbiting in a magnetically neutral environment, the magnetic pole of the Earth would coincide with the geographic pole, which is the pole of its spin axis, shown in red. But with the spin axis being tilted by 23 degrees away from the external magnetic field, from the primal fields, the magnetic pole was historically deflected away from the spin axis by up to 23 degrees, into line with the external magnetic field. Since the external magnetic field is now rapidly weakening, with the primal fields getting weaker, together with the weakening of the Sun, the historic magnetic pole deflection has weakened accordingly, and dramatically so. What we see here is not a projection of something that may happen in distant times. It has already happened, according to on-the-ground measurements, and it is ongoing. If one projects Ulysses measurements forward in time in a linear manner, we can detect the solar wind to essentially cease in the 2030s. After that, further reductions of the plasma inflow into the solar system will cause the solar energy output itself to begin to diminish, which reduces the plasma flow still further. Eventually, a threshold level will be reached on this downslope, at which the electromagnetic primal fields, which are created by flowing plasma, are no longer maintained, which then will vanish. This may happen in the 2050s or sooner. Without the interstellar plasma being concentrated by the primal fields around the Sun, the plasma density around the Sun will be substantially weaker. It will revert to a kind of default state. At this state, the surface temperature of the Sun will drop from the present 5,800 degrees to roughly 4,000 degrees. The 4000 degrees level is widely common throughout the galaxy at the present epoch. The lower surface temperature corresponds with a 70% lower energy output, and in addition with a shift in the light profile towards the red, which affects the light absorption of the green chlorophyll that plants depend on. When this far-reaching dramatic solar energy reduction begins, an ice age begins on Earth. That's what we have to prepare our world for. The fact that the Sun is currently superpowered by active primal fields that focus concentrated plasma onto the Sun is strikingly evident in the measurements made by the Ulysses spacecraft. It saw a void over the Sun's poles. The spacecraft had operated in a polar orbit around the Sun at a distance roughly equal to the orbit of Jupiter. Over each pole of the Sun during the orbits, the spacecraft's solar wind flow measurements were sharply disrupted. The disruption occurred precisely where one would expect the plasma inflow into the Sun's plasmasphere to be located. Unfortunately, the Ulysses spacecraft was not equipped to measure the inflow. The principle hadn't been discovered before the mission was created. When the ice age begins, the focused inflow will no longer exist. But what is it that causes such a large fluctuation by which cosmic scale systems can collapse and vanish? All cosmic plasma streams, by being electric in nature, are subject to electric resonance effects. The 100,000 years Ice Age cycles are evidently inherent in the resonance phenomenon in interstellar plasma streams. The shorter resonance cycles for the 1470 years Dansker-Oeschger events may be inherent in correspondingly smaller plasma structures, such as that of the theorized Oort cloud that encapsulated the solar system up to a large distance. It has been suggested that the solar system itself is made up of several nested sets of primal fields, which may all be located within the theorized Oort cloud surrounding the solar system. As I said before, the timing suggests that it may have been a Dansker-Oeschger oscillation event that saved our worldship from sinking into the Big Ice Age during the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, that we might have been precariously close to. The carbon-14 measurements tell us that the Sun had been diminishing for a long period leading into the Little Ice Age, right up to the point when almost no sunspots were observed over a long period of decades. Then something dramatically happened at this critical point that gave the Sun a new burst of life, which rescued the worldship from sinking. If the sudden recovery of the Sun was caused by a Dansker-Oeschger oscillation, we cannot expect a repeat this time around, because the next Dansker-Oeschger event is more than 1,000 years distant, too far to rescue the worldship a second time. It appears that a spectacular breakout from the Little Ice Age in the 1700s was an extremely fortunate anomaly that will not likely repeat itself. The renowned atmospheric scientist, the late Dr. Zbigniew Jaworowski, one-time chairman of the Scientific Council of the Central Laboratory for Radiological Protection in Warsaw, and chair of the United Nations Scientific Community on the Effects of Atomic Radiation for 1981 and 1982, wrote in his 2003 paper, "The Ice Age is Coming," commenting on the timing of the interglacial warm period, saying that the average duration of such a phase has already been exceeded by 500 years, and that when it ends, the transition will happen in an extremely short time. Dr. Jaworowski speaks from personal observations in these matters by his long involvement in ice excavations from 15 glaciers on 6 continents in his 50 years career. The early ending of the interglacial period that he had predicted would have happened during the Little Ice Age in the 1600s. If a Dansker-Oeschger oscillation pulse hadn't revitalized the Sun at this time. This means that the end of our interglacial period is sure to happen when the revitalizing pulse runs its course, which we see now happening, and see happening fast. The evidence that lies before us that the interglacial is ending is amazingly multifaceted. We see the principle reflected in carbon-14 measurements. We see the weakening of the Sun measured in space by the Ulysses satellite that was launched via the Space Shuttle in 1990. We see sunspot cycles diminishing at the same time in the same ratio. We see the weakening of the solar system, also reflected in the magnetic pole drift in the Arctic. That something big is in progress that affects the entire solar system, including the Sun that is a part of it. One can say with reasonable certainty that the Ice Age is coming, and that it is not far off. With all the main indicators now fast diminishing, we will see the big phase shift happening soon, most likely in the 2050s, by which the Sun's energy output diminishes by as much as 70%. That's the best estimate that is possible based on the wide range of the currently observed dynamics. And as amazing as this may seem, we can understand what is happening and can recognize that we have the power as human beings to respond to what we know and to move with our knowledge to change our world. The 2050s estimate leaves us not much time to prepare our world for what is to come, but enough time to get the job done if we get started soon. As human beings, we have the capability to recognize in the mind what needs to be accomplished before the primal fields collapse and the big ice age phase shift happens. If we act as human beings with the corresponding love for one another, we will build the needed infrastructures that assure the continuing of our living on this planet in an ice age world with a 10 billion world population that we may have in the 2050s, which we may also require to get the job done. Thus it is reasonable to assume that we will build the 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, that we will require to relocate ourselves into the tropics, together with our industries and agriculture, before the phase shift happens, when the regions outside the tropics become uninhabitable. We will, in this flow, create new agriculture for us, with much of it operating in indoor facilities, even in the tropics, and much of that located afloat on the equatorial seas between the hurricane zones for the lack of large-scale suitable land in the tropics. The task may seem enormous in the currently small-minded world, but with automated high-temperature industrial processes implemented on the required large scale, the task may be quite easily accomplished. The technologies, energy resources, and even the material resources do all presently exist in abundance. So what would hinder us to get a job done? Should we choose to fulfill the task before us, the power of the economic and cultural renaissance that flows from the fulfillment of such a gigantic project promises to be far greater than anything that we have ever experienced. It promises to be greater even than what we can likely imagine in our presently small-minded world. Our small-minded world is laced with terror, looting, and murdering on the largest ever scale. Empire is a folly that we may ultimately not survive unless the folly is superseded with something as grand as the Ice Age challenge now before us. The Ice Age challenge, if we respond to it, is of a type that inspires a new sense of humanity in all of us, that is long overdue. If, on the other hand, we choose to live like animals do, who live for the moment and have no concept of a future, then the future will happen as it must by its dynamics, and will overwhelm us all when the Titanic World Ship sinks into a new ice age with 7 billion people on board. When this happens, without technological infrastructures fully built and operational, only a few people will likely survive, even in the tropics, by the primitive means that then remain, such as by living off fish, if there is enough fish remaining. In this case, 90,000 years later, when the next interglacial period begins, the few survivors, if there are any, will repopulate the landscape and start a new civilization, and may come to the same point where we stand today, where the decision must be made to care for one another on a grand scale by which we are able to continue to exist as a civilization. I would like to think, however, that we will choose to live in our time, rather than choosing to perish. We know what type of world we will face in the near future, to judge by the mountains of evidence that we have already uncovered in space, in ice, in deep-sea sediments, in cosmic observations, and in laboratory experiments. And we know by this evidence what we need to do. We know that we need to respond to the knowledge that we have gained. We also know thereby what tragedies we will face if we fail to respond to what we now know. The consequence of failing isn't a pleasant fate, to be sure. With all this considered, it is reasonable to assume that we will move ahead and build ourselves the bright new future, the brightest ever imagined, that deprives the Ice Age of its sting. Sure, the naysayers who cling to the old model, for which no real evidence actually exists, are many, who utter their opposition to the plasma sun concept in great choruses, driven by many invariable doctrines that are iron hard as prison fences. Nevertheless, I like to think that truth and reason and our love for one another and for our children will at length be honored, and that they will prevail in the end and have their day. The stakes are infinitely too high for humanity to accept defeat by self-denial, to lay itself down to die, and to commit its children to death without a fight for continued living. The fight is a fight for life indeed, especially for the life of all who expect to be living in the 2050s. That's what we must commit us to across the world. If we lose this fight, we will die without exceptions when the Ice Age begins, when the world ship sinks deep into a new Ice Age without the lifeboats having been prepared for all humanity. If, on the other hand, by some miracle, the sinking of the world ship may be held off one more time, like it had happened in the 1600s, and we had created a brand new high-level civilization for us in the tropics in preparation for it, nothing would be lost in that case. We would simply end up with a vastly richer world. Responding to the Ice Age is a win-win proposition, no matter what will happen. The outcome will be like heaven in comparison with the near-certain death humanity will suffer should it gamble with its existence and fail. Thus, I think we will choose the richer option, which cannot fail no matter what.